Just so you know, this content is for education and facilitating self-empowerment. However, this platform exists to cultivate an addictive and abusive codependent relationship with a vapid materialist pop culture, while data scraping algorithms sync your personal metadata onto pattern maps used to anticipate, then invert emergent trends in our collective evolution of consciousness in an effort to compromise our ongoing mass awakening. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Symbols, Patterns, and Gnosis. As always, it's Jason Bickford, and in this Gnostic Sunday School presentation, we're going to build on some previous concepts from earlier Gnostic Sunday School videos, as well as some other recent videos loaded to this page. So this is going to be a two-part presentation, basically a longer video I thought would be better presented as two uploads. So we're going to call this Gnostic Sunday School 6.1, and we're going to be dealing with the ill wind. And I'm going to take a look at the predictive nature of inspired creative output. And I strongly recommend, as prerequisite viewing to this video, you take a look at Decoding Dune and Gnostic Sunday School 3, Carbon Beast Lifeforms in particular. Let's begin with a brief example of co-creative precognition. And we'll take a look at how Radiohead's January 2019 single, Ill Wind, embeds COVID paradigms. Radiohead released the album A Moon-Shaped Pool in 2016. Its lead single was Burn the Witch. During the A Moon-Shaped Pool sessions, Radiohead recorded the song Ill Wind, but it was left off the album and released later in January of 2019 as a single. The song's title and brief lyrics suggest a precognition of COVID paradigms, airborne illness, and requiring social distancing, and they map onto concepts of co-creative language in a pattern-based world I've covered in several recent videos, such as GSS3, the Carbon Beast Lifeforms, and the first installment of my Dune 2021 film Symbolism Breakdown. So I picked up this Radiohead single in January of 2019 when it was released. Ill wind, keep your distance, then no harm will come. No ill wind will blow, will blow. Sudden words must never be spoken. An ill wind will blow, will blow. Keep your cool. Do not give into emotion. An ill wind will blow. So we're being told here an ill wind, or spirit, or breath, will blow. So it's predictive in nature. The tone of the lyrics are emphatically predictive, telling you something will happen. We're also told to keep our distance. That was the initial response. Shelter in place, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. No harm will come to you if you shelter in place. Then sudden words must never be spoken. Keep your cool. Don't give into emotion. So we've got an airborne illness. People are getting triggered, and we're to shelter in place and keep our social distance. 6 feet apart, 6 feet under. You got to look at it from the right angle. Let's take a look at some esoteric patterns and how art seems to predict life. And first, let's hear a little bit from Dr. Ian McGilchrist about the nature of poetry, and I'll unpack this further.
But I always say you can be as clear as you can, but no clearer than that. And that when you start trying to go for greater precision or clarity, you lose it. Because what we're trying to deal with are things for which everyday language hasn't got the right terms. Everyday language has evolved to enable us to tackle practical problems of survival. But we haven't really got an extensive vocabulary for things that language leaves behind. This is why we have poetry. This is the point of poetry, is to take language beyond language and therefore make it more rich and more fulfilled as language.
I'll go into this deeper in part 2, but just briefly I'll mention that the Vedic tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and a modern psychoanalytic tradition, as well as some interesting and I'd say criminally slept on intellectual ideas from Rudolf Steiner and Owen Barfield and others, map onto this idea of predictive language coming from something that would be either the Akashic Records or God's book or this collective unconscious and this kind of collective memory. We even heard just recently Vice President Kamala Harris referring to our collective memory.
Fellow Americans, good morning. Certain dates echo throughout history, including dates that instantly remind all who have lived through them where they were and what they were doing when our democracy came under assault. Dates that occupy not only a place on our calendars, but a place in our collective memory.
Let's take a look back at my breakdown of the recent Dune film, in which I took an opportunity to talk about these emergent patterns within our collective language and in the co-created human output that we're syncopating with symbols. Language leads to image. So we use language to describe our experience. That language is then illustrated either in our minds or through entertainments and media, and these visual icons and symbols and the language map onto stories that have been repeating throughout human mythologies, poetry, and co-creative output. And I've suggested that the source of this, whether it's the Akashic Records or God's book or the psychoanalytic Jungian subconscious, or something that is kind of a little bit like all of those things, right? A deeper truth that maybe we can't completely articulate with language, ironically, but is the substrate from which we draw our language, particularly when we're creative. So we have stories to tell. We also have lives to live. The lives that we live are based on our thoughts, which at the root of is language. So we use language to describe to ourselves and each other what we're thinking and feeling, and we do the same thing with creative output. So whether it's Dune or the movie Apocalypse Now or scripture or poetry or songs, the language tells a story and the stories are repeating. And very often what I find is that the inspired creative media, as I've illustrated time and time again, has elements embedded within it that map onto future realities. So patterns are playing out. It's not as if history repeats itself so much as these archetypal forms replicate almost like a fractal, and they're language based. And there's different ways we can remix the language and play out the symbolism, but the general patterns of the symbolism play out. And so I was pointing towards this phenomenon of the ill spirit and the bad wind and the bad breath symbolism manifesting in our lives as well as in the co-created media and songs and movies and whatnot that we were consuming. So there was a repeating pattern in the media as well as in our activities, which are intrinsically entwined. So we're telling each other stories, we're living out the stories, and the stories were pointing towards a devastating wind. And then this happened shortly after those videos.
Morning, it's just after 11 o'clock here on the East Coast, and we are coming on the air with an update on those devastating tornadoes that hit the Southeast and the Midwest in the middle of the night. The sun has now been up for a few hours in that region, and search and rescue crews there, along with first responders, are picking through the rubble. They are looking for survivors and recovering the dead. This morning, Kentucky's Governor Andy Beshear said that he expects 50 to 100 people may have been killed in his state, many of them at a candle factory in the small town of Mayfield. He is now taking part in a news conference. Let's listen in.
And sadly, far too many homes that people were likely in, entirely devastated. This will be, I believe, the deadliest tornado system to ever run through Kentucky. You know, earlier this morning at about 5 a.m., we were pretty sure that we would lose over 50 Kentuckians. I'm now certain that that number is north of 70. It may, in fact, end up exceeding 100 before the day is done. The damage is even worse now that we have first light. A couple places have been hit incredibly hard. Certainly Mayfield here in Grace County, but everywhere along the line of this tornado, that touched down and stayed down for 227 miles, over 200 in Kentucky, has been severely and significantly impacted.
So less than a month before this tragedy, I was speaking about an increasing amount of patterns I saw mapping onto this idea of dangerous wind and breath and spirit. So the spirit of the age was dangerous speech, bad breath, a bad spirit coming out of the mouth, as well as deadly winds and a deadly spirit in the air manifest as an airborne illness. I found it interesting that a number of the media reports focused on this scene from the Legion Theater, in which the back of the screen is just ripped out into the buildings behind the theater. That's the Legion Theater in Mayfield, Kentucky. Kentucky got most of the damage here. Legion is the name of the spirits that were possessing a man whom Christ healed, and he pulled the demons out of this guy who identified themselves as Legion, and he cast them into a herd of swine that then went and jumped off a cliff to their deaths. So, social distancing, bad spirit, ill wind, ill speech, strong emotions, keeping your distance from the strong emotions and the dangerous language. All of this stuff maps onto the current spirit of the age. The esoteric concept of a pattern-based world in which seed crystal fractals and an ineffably created reality replicate and manifest through manifold language and symbol as the substrate to all levels of reality is one I've been unpacking in videos and essays for a couple of years now. So let's go deeper down this rabbit hole, and we'll begin with Radiohead, and then I'm going to incorporate other music and symbols and media and phenomenon in the political sphere. Radiohead literally means receiving messages in your head, right? You've got a radio for your head. Radio tunes into different wavelengths and receives messages. Let's take a look at this emergent idea of the brain as a radio. The idea that inert matter could randomly combine, spring to life, and then give rise to human consciousness ultimately is one of the most unfathomable and inelegant tenets of the secular scientific materialist perspective that's dominated academia and Western culture since the mid-19th century. So the atheists, the secular materialists, the pro-science, unscientific Darwinian evolutionists will not agree with this, but there is an emergent trend viewing the brain as radio, not transmitter. So the brain is not so much creating your consciousness with inert matter, soft gray and white matter in your head. A growing number of neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, and other thinkers are aligning their views with consciousness with that of Eastern mystics, suggesting that the physical brain doesn't generate consciousness locally, but functions more like a radio tuning into a non-local broadcast. So in the same way that the language being at the substrate of our collective co-creation is involved in patterns that repeat like a fractal, so too is the very language constructed of ingredients which can be remixed and repeated like fractals to gain more truth. In other words, the words that make up the ideas that we use to explain and co-create our world are also made up of pictographic icons, which can be decoded through a couple different ways in order to unpack more truth from them. Now, I'm not suggesting you go and anagram everything you read, see, and hear, but sometimes certain titles and phrases ring a bell, and I intuitively go to the online anagrammer here and break the spell, see if I can find more embedded information. Now, when I tried to anagram a moon-shaped pool, I got an interesting glitch. The page refused to do it without any prompting, so I typed in a couple words I saw. A moon-shaped pool can be anagrammed to spell a number of phrases. One of them is Mason Pedo Hoopla, pedo being a short colloquialism for pedophilia. Hoopla is like a much ado about something.
He's Italian and Greek, I mean, you know. And a very good cook. And yeah, his risotto recipe is still there if you want to see it. And I'm sure there's something very nefarious about that risotto recipe. So all of a sudden, John's writing about pizza, and one of these really, I consider, evil people in the media world and in the online world, out of whole cloth make up this story that John Podesta and I are running a child trafficking ring in the basement of the Comet Pizza Parlor.
By the way, there is no basement.
Yeah, there is no basement. Now, you would think people would be laughing like crazy, shaking their heads, but if you migrate that crazy story to Facebook posts, to news outlets, there are people who will believe that, including this very unfortunate young man in North Carolina who believed it.
One of, if not the most obvious way this ill spirit, bad breath, ill wind pattern I've been unpacking for a while manifests in our collective experience, for sure, is the pandemic paradigm. Now, the variants of the pandemic have been described and named with Greek letters. And I think of the fraternal orders, the Greek letter societies. It's interesting here that delta is a triangle. The letter is symbolically represented by a triangle. And Omicron is a circle. Looks like an O. So we have delta and Omicron mapping onto the pizza slice and a ring, which reminds me of that original anagram for a moon-shaped pool. Now I have to be very careful what I say about that pizza and the ring and what Hillary was getting into, but we'll go there in part 2. The mainstream media got wind of anagrams regarding Delta Omicron that can be anagrammed to spell media control. Omicron itself is an anagram for moronic. Interesting. But Delta Omicron can also be anagrammed to spell Rand Emit Loco, or Rand Loco time. Loco being crazy, and Rand being a reference to the Rand Corporation. This was a military contractor think tank that developed the internet over 50 years ago. Now, in the film A Beautiful Mind, the Hollywood version of the biography of John Forbes Nash Jr., mathematical genius and allegedly crazy person, he's shown going into a CIA office and cracking this code here up on the wall that involves the Cold War and the Russians. But he actually worked for the Rand Corps, and the Rand Corps was a contractor for the CIA. So John Forbes Nash worked for Rand Corps, and they're also referenced in Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, and they're developing the Doomsday device.
Dr. Strangelove, do we have anything like that in the works?
A moment, please, Mr. President. Under the authority granted me as Director of Weapons Research and Development, I commissioned last year a study of this project by the Bland Corporation. Based on the findings of the report, my conclusion was that this idea was not a practical deterrent for reasons which at this moment must be all too obvious.
Then you mean it is possible for them to have built such a thing?
Mr. President, the technology required is easily within the means of even the smallest nuclear power. It requires only the will to do so.
But today, war is too important to be left to politicians. They have neither the time, the training, nor the inclination for strategic thought. I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
So if I take a look at the symbolism in Dr. Strangelove and see different paradigms as just symbolic ingredients, we can rearrange those ingredients the same way we do with the anagram here. And what we can see is that there's some world leaders who are developing a doomsday weapon. It comes from the Bland Corporation, which is a satire on the Rand Corporation. So we have these guys under that circle light sitting at the table. We got Peter Sellers playing Dr. Strangelove. He's in a wheelchair. This reminds me of the wheelchair assassins of Infinite Jest. And if you look at the wheels on the wheelchair, looks like a pizza. So we got a guy sitting on his pizza mobile, coming up with the internet, which is the doomsday device, and it's being used to drive people crazy, like that general there who's going on about fluoridation in the water, and he ends up killing himself. So the doomsday device is being used to set people at war with themselves. So the doomsday device isn't a weapon that's going to end the war. It's a psychological and social engineering tool or weapon that's used to create the war, the Cold War. And here we have a German. It's kind of hilarious the way Peter Sellers portrays this guy. He's got a strange glove or a strange love. Dr. Strangelove, strange glove. He's got the glove on his hand, kind of like Thanos, and he can't stop himself from doing a Nazi salute, and he's got to take his left hand and stomp it down. So we have this kind of polarization embedded within the German scientist, and we have technology being used by master craftsmen in order to make people go crazy, kill each other, and kill themselves. So that seems to be, there's many different ways they can slice this pie. Everyone gets a slice, and they're going to keep playing this Infinite Jest game forever. And so the engines of chaos are the engines of order, and they're going to square the circle. Squaring the circle reminds me of a pizza in a box, right? The box is square, the pizza is a circle. So we've got all these guys sitting down at a table trying to figure out what to put on their pizza toppings. There's this interesting Revenge of the Nerds paradigm there as well. The world leaders sitting in the war room talking about how they're going to depopulate the earth with these doomsday weapons, and then they're going to have all these attractive women left to themselves to repopulate the world, and every man's going to get X many physically attractive women, and everyone seems to like that idea. So we've got Revenge of the Nerds, Infinite Jest, the pizza party phenomenon that Hillary was talking about, and we've got the manufactured polarization, which is embedded in another anagram of moon-shaped pool, shampoo on old ape, which reminds me of another old movie, The Planet of the Apes. The damn dirty apes, right? Now we all know what the apes versus the white blonde-haired guy is, right? And we've got this paradigm in the modern secular materialist world where, the further you get from your Darwinist roots, the more evolved you are. So we all live with this collective manufactured memory that white men are superior to the damn dirty apes.
Why did you run away?
Security police.
I'm in charge of this man.
No longer, madam. He is now in the custody of the Ministry of Science.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
So I intuitively tuned in to Radiohead as co-created and inspired work. And so it's no surprise that I would find patterns of meaning embedded in their poetry and symbolism. And this reference to the shampoo on the ape, reminding me of the Planet of the Apes movie, brings us back to the Ministry of Science and the pattern of brainwashing. I think it's interesting that the apes have cleaner hair than the blonde-haired guy in that video. But the Ministry of Science would be the materialistic scientific paradigm that's come about in the past 150 plus years. So the further you are from Africa, the more evolved you are. And so the apes are going to remind you of African people. Apes and black people come from Africa, so the paradigm says. So they're going to rinse, lather, repeat, the same pattern over and over. And we have constructed paradigms, intentionally constructed, in order to play this infinite game. So we've triggered Charlton Heston here, aka Moses, and the NRA guy waving his gun around. Not from my cold dead hands. It's all the same guy. He's still playing the same patterns throughout his life. So this is a way in which, we've got bad information floating around, and sometimes it infects people and they're typecast their entire lives, like Charlton Heston. So we've got the bad information, the bad dope. That's also the manteca or tar that's dredged up from the Sheol. And we take this fossil fuel of the giant reptilian brain, the reptile ego of before, or of the lower mind or the lower self, and we burn that up into the air and we breathe it up, and now we've got an ill wind spreading around. So if you've watched the Carbon Beast life forms and the Dune video, you will see how this all ties into the collective unconscious, the Akashic records, God's book or God's memory as inscribed or referred to in Malachi and referred to by Jesus. So those who have their name written in God's book are remembered by God and have a spiritual life after physical life. But you can have a spiritual life now and a personal relationship with God. And that would enable certain people to see these patterns. We've got bad dope, bad tar, oil spills, information leaks, spelling out the corrupt nature of the elite and the ill or bad intentions of people in power. So the sociopaths or the reptilians, as some conspiracy theorists will say, and I don't use conspiracy theorist as a derogatory term. I would be labeled a conspiracy theorist by the overwhelming majority of people who hear my work. In that Carbon Beast Lifeform video, I took a look at biblical symbolism of the beast, and this idea of 666 and 600, 6 being a reference to the book playing out over and over again. And the infinite book is The Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, which embeds a character who discovers unified code theory. And it's interesting that I didn't read that book until I'd already stumbled upon some of the concepts that I would later flesh out as infinite code theory or unified code theory. Same thing, basically. So the book repeating itself, there's a book 360 code embedded in 600, 6 as it's described in the King James. I think that might also be how it's worded in the Geneva Bible. I'll have to double check that. Okay, I just double checked that. The Geneva Bible of 1599 also uses 600, 6. So we are living a life living in the beast or the man in the carbon beast life form, spending a quarantina in the upper deck of Sheol. A quarantina is 40 days, so Moses on the mountain, Noah in the ark, Christ in the wilderness. We've got Parsifal and Ready Player One going into the digital quarantina and having quite a real experience. So we have the flesh of the man and the beast, the carbon beast life forms, whose number is 6 protons, 6 electrons, 6 neutrons. That's the 666. So we are cast into or created and living within a system that bears the mark of the beast. So this might not be a barcode on your wrist or some sort of universal Bitcoin-based social credit system, although the patterns of this system could map out onto those things becoming a reality here. But what we're being shown is that nature of reality is far different than the scientific materialist perspective. So the smarty pants with the science don't have it all figured out. That comes to us through intuition, spiritual intimation, and Gnosis. And I'll get into how Christ and St. Paul in the New Testament refer to Gnosis and Sophia in the spirit and wind of the age. So we have dope, it's bad for us, that's the information as well as the drugs. The heroin for the masses, so you pick your poison. and you end up getting stuck in a cold war. Right now people are catching a cold. It's creating a social contagion as well as this paradigm of a pandemic. POS daemon hoopla is another anagram for a moon-shaped pool, and that could refer to POS as piece of shit or point of sale. And the point of sale daemon hoopla seems to map onto that concept of the mark of the beast being required in order to conduct business as it's described in Revelation. And Revelation is another name for the book of Apocalypse, and apocalypse in Greek literally means to unveil. So we have the rinse, lather, and repeat. Your spiritual nature is cast into flesh, bearing the mark of the beast, and you are to learn some lessons. And these stories repeat themselves until you rinse, lather, and repeat enough to come clean. And there's always going to be some bigger evil, right? You might think to yourself, well, I'm not one of these elite people involved in some shady, corrupt global government or human trafficking or doing stuff to kids, so by comparison, I'm all right. But everyone's got their own stuff to work on. Now, this media embeds multi-layered, manifold symbolism, and after we start to unpack some of this symbolism, we see this web of interconnections. With that in mind, think of the word fossil fuel as ill light. The word phos comes from a Latin for light. That's where we get phosphorus. It has a glow. So fossil fuel is an ill light or a bad light, which maps onto this concept of the corrupt spirit within the Sheol, or the quarantina wilderness in which we live. So some people say you only have one life to live. Maybe on the bigger picture that's true, but this physical life in the carbon beast life form that has a beginning and end is only part of it. So there's a spiritual life, and that spirit is something that we tap into. And when we tap into that with benevolent and forthright intention, then we create truth, whether we realize it or not. And so the digging up the fossil fuel is digging up a memory of a time previous, which was then reset. And as we're burning up the fossil fuel, largely made of carbon, 666 fossil fuel and tar, pulled up and dredged up, creates illness in the air.
Cloth masks are not appropriate for this pandemic. It's not appropriate for Omicron. It was not appropriate for Delta, Alpha, or any of the previous variants either, because we're dealing with something that's airborne.
So how about some positive patterns, right? It's not all doom and gloom here. Ultimately, the bigger picture is that this is a test. In John 20:22, which reminds me of the year we're in now, Christ returns during the Pentecost and breathes out the Holy Spirit onto the earth. This could be like a spiritual reset as well as an apocalypse. When we refer to apocalypse in pop culture, we think of death and destruction and cataclysm and world-ending events. However, the word apocalypse literally comes from Greek terms meaning to uncover or to reveal. So something that is hidden is revealed. If we sync that up with the Pentecostal event of the new breath in John 20:22, we see a period of trial and tribulation, the death of the Son of God, or God himself as he's often described in the scripture. So we're living in that Nietzschean nihilistic era that's coming to an end, and we're seeing the emergence of a 21st century renaissance. And there's a push and pull. So the spirit of the age wants to continue playing the infinite game on its terms, and the emergence of a new spirit, which seems to be predicted in the patterns to be beginning this year. The conspiracy theorists, the truthers, the skeptics talking about the pandemic and the government's responses seem to suggest that we're entering into this kind of apocalyptic end of the world type paradigm, when I actually see something positive on the horizon. So I would not be surprised if 2022 is the year in which COVID recedes and we see some new paradigms and patterns emerge. So we live in something like the quarantina world, whether we're up on the mountain or inside the ark or in the Sheol or the wilderness. I think all of those patterns map onto one another. Now I'm even reminded of that, there was a speculation that they had found Noah's Ark, and it was where? Up on a mountaintop. So that's where the ark came to rest as the waters receded. So we have the mountaintop of Moses, the ark of Noah, and the wilderness of Christ, mapping onto this concept that I'm going to go into in a separate video for Gnostic Sunday School in the future about why we're in the desert and the Sheol. And we're in the upper deck. So we're digging into lower Sheol, which is not entirely unlike a place of torment. So it would map onto some concepts of what we think of about hell. But pop culture and other works of literature and poetry have shaped the modern Christian mind as far as what hell is like. What we see as hell is largely not based on scripture and pop culture. Anyway, so we're in Sheol, like the luxury seats are first class, and we're going through, and that's good news for us spiritually, right? You've earned your place out of lower Sheol, or you never went there in the first place, and you're being tested, and lower Sheol is being tapped physically through fossil fuel, which maps onto this idea of bad light. And the bad light is spreading around the nation and around the world, and it's infecting the minds of people who then understand and describe their world in a particular way. Let's take a look at No Country for Old Men. We seem to be in the United States and in Western society, we seem to be in a place that's no country for old men. Men with memory, perhaps. And there's a spirit going around, and it can be weaponized with technology in order to blow people's minds. And this could inspire them to act out and possibly kill themselves or go crazy. So what we have in that film symbolically is a killer walking around with pressurized wind that is blowing people's minds, literally. And so that could be seen as a weaponized apocalypse, an unveiling that blows your mind. There's also a positive pattern. If you close your eyes and just think of the symbolism, something is coming around and painlessly taking people out of this world who have maybe, earned their ticket to the next level. That's the old men. Anyway, I talked about Nabokov's pale fire and a bad spirit in previous videos in November and December, and shortly after this happened in Colorado.
A state of emergency in Colorado, with thousands of people fleeing their homes as two fast-growing wildfires fueled by hurricane-force winds destroyed hundreds of homes. More than 17,000 people are still without power across the state. CNN's Lucy Kavanaugh live in Denver with more. Lucy?
John, this has been absolutely catastrophic and devastating for Colorado. This is already being described as the most destructive wildfire in Colorado history, with more than 500 homes burned. The expectation, unfortunately, is as day breaks, those numbers may rise.
Two wind-fueled wildfires sweeping through parts of Boulder County, Colorado on Thursday.
This fire is frankly a force of nature. Gusts of 100, 110 miles an hour can and have moved this fire down a football field in a matter of seconds,
prompting the governor to declare a state of emergency, forcing tens of thousands of people to evacuate.
I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not claiming that I predicted this event. This happened right in my backyard. The footage you're looking at now I filmed from my bedroom window. And that is Louisville, Colorado, and I was right on the border of Louisville and Lafayette. So it was looking like this fire might come right over the tree line about a quarter mile in my backyard. I could visibly see trees on fire. Over 1,000 homes were destroyed. It looks like maybe 2 people lost their life. They're still looking for some missing person. So this was the most devastating fire of its kind in Colorado history. And it was fueled by hurricane speed winds. So there was a small brush fire, incidentally, that started at the 12 Tribes Christian community. They're described as Christian. I think their ideology maps more closely onto Judaism, but they're referred to as a Christian group. I get some David Koresh vibes off of this group of people that's now being looked at as the cause of this fire. Initially, they said power lines went down because of the wind. That turned out not to be true. Meanwhile, I was talking about symbolism that I was picking up on that was increasing in frequency. So I talked about Radiohead releasing Ill Wind in January of 2019, and a year later we're dealing with the COVID phenomenon, and the paradigms in early COVID response was shelter in place, 6 feet distancing. There's a bad airborne spirit going around, you got to cover your breath. So the brief lyrics of that song seem to symbolically predict the paradigms of the pandemic. And then in November 1st and November 18th, I directly dealt with the increasing emergence of this symbolism. And less than a month later, we had the most devastating tornado rip through Kentucky and completely demolish multiple towns like Mayfield here. Absolutely decimated, a major loss of life. And a tornado is literally a bad wind, right? It's the symbolism that kicks off the Wizard of Oz. And sometimes I feel like I'm living in a type of Oz environment myself. So this happens right before Christmas. And then shortly after that tornado in mid-December, we have just after Christmas the fires, historic fires fueled by hurricane wind. So again, weaponized wind, pale fire, stoked flames. And it seems like the nature of our co-creation that I was picking up on is a pathway into a collective memory that we may have been, forced to forget through a cultural reset.
Collective memory.
And now the mythless man, eternally hungry, stands among all pasts, digging and burrowing for roots, be it that he had to dig for them even in the remotest antiquities. To what does the tremendous historical need of the unsatisfied modern culture, the gathering around of countless other cultures, the consuming desire for recognition point, if not to the loss of the myth, to the loss of the mythical home, the mythical womb? Without myth, however, every culture loses its healthy creative power.
Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. The most pressing problem of man today is the loss of meaning. Meaning is rooted in the past. When knowledge of the past fades, so does the meaning of life. Today's man does not know where he comes from, who he is, and where he is going. He has become a pawn in the hands of powers that can direct him at will. Uprooted from his past, there is no foundation. And without a foundation based on reality, there is no way to develop an objective understanding of the world. Only the way back to one's roots gives meaning back to life. Epigenetics, the study of heritable changes in gene expression that are not directly encoded in our DNA, suggests that our life experiences, such as hardships, traumatic experiences, etc., are passed on to subsequent generations. Mythological and religious traditions go even further and speak of a collective memory. Already in the Vedas, the holy scriptures of Hinduism, a kind of universal memory is mentioned. The Sanskrit word akasha stands for heaven, space, or ether, and, according to the Eastern wisdom tradition, refers to the most subtle of the 5 elements from which everything else was created. Thus, according to Indian mythology, all thoughts that have ever been thought and all deeds that have ever been performed are stored in this information field, which is also expressed in the legendary palm leaf libraries of India and Sri Lanka. The conception of a world memory also exists in the Occidental culture. We can find similar references in the Bible, for example, when the book of Isaiah speaks of a memory book.
Every activity is a form of energy, and energy cannot be dissipated. It is retained. We are in a closed system. See, everything you do, everything you say, every action you take, every penny you earn or spend is recorded.
So we can assume that all experiences of our ancestors still exist in an energy field invisible to us. Until around 100 years ago, the ether was still a standard concept in physics to explain the properties of invisible space. And even if today we are largely disconnected from our past, the experiences have not disappeared, but are only buried. Accordingly, it must be possible for us to reconnect with our past if we lift the veil and allow the memories to surface again. In order to access collective memories, a collective effort is required to a certain degree. An individual alone is not able to break through the amnesia. There are images that are so strongly charged with meaning that people are inexplicably drawn to them. The world's religions draw to some extent on such images, albeit in extremely destructive ways. Myths and fairy tales also contain such images. The more a myth is charged with meaning, the more important was its role in our past. By the radiance of a myth, we can already recognize its importance for mankind, if we allow it and let ourselves be touched by it. For example, the flood has burned itself into our collective memory, but so have the stories of giants, dragons, or malicious witches. The more we humans abandon these mythical images, the more we alienate ourselves from our own past and thus from our own being. This process of self-alienation began with the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Immanuel Velikovsky writes,
Amnesia is one of the defense reactions of man. We know the effects of battle shock on soldiers. In the older Greek authors, the Pythagoreans and the Stoics, you find definite statements indicating that catastrophes which occurred in the history of the human race and in the history of our Earth were not abnormal events. They were actually dominant, repeating themselves again and again. But from the historical records, we see that the knowledge of the catastrophes disappeared slowly into oblivion. Plato described cataclysms in several works. He wrote about worlds destroyed and rebuilt. In his Timaeus, he noted that the Greeks do not remember ancient catastrophes besides the deluge. He adds that the people of his time, as the priests of Sais told Solon, were unable to remember these catastrophic events. In another work, whose authorship is probably wrongly ascribed to Plato, he is presented as believing in a peaceful universe. Plato's pupil Aristotle refused to believe in catastrophes. The scholarly world has accepted Aristotle's view that the planets can never change their motions. He, more than anyone else, is responsible for the continuing belief that we live in a safe world, on a planet to which nothing like collisions can happen. Aristotle argued that those who believe in celestial catastrophes should be brought to trial and, if convicted, punished by death.
So if you tell the average person that there are structures on planet Earth, the architecture of which remains a mystery, they're likely going to assume that you're talking about the pyramids of Egypt. Yet there seems to have been a massive worldwide cultural reset that syncopated with the materialist scientific revolution in the mid-19th century. And before that, the horse and buggy era seems to have inherited massive stone, iron, and steel architecture all over the planet with similar designs that seem to, well, nowadays we're told it comes from the classic Greco-Roman period. It's all around the world, architects in Japan and Russia and Western Europe and the United States were making these structures, which were largely a throwback to the Greco-Roman period. There seems to have been a cycle of golden ages in which human beings were producing things at a much higher level than they are now. And this scientific revolution in the mid-19th century seems to have had something to do with that. Now, what does that have to do with the music and pop culture that I've been talking about and the symbolism in movies? Well, I believe that creative humans, whether they're being creatively deceptive or poetic and artistic, are tapping into that Akashic record or God's book or the collective unconscious, and this tapping into our collective memory and the patterns and icons of a previous age show us this repetitive nature of the structure of reality. And so when a musician like, say, Frank Ocean samples some lyrics from a musician like Elliott Smith, who I went into in the Carbon Beast Lifeforms video, there's maybe a sign there that there's a similar source of inspiration between these artists who, on the surface level, don't appear to have a whole lot in common, but are intrinsically related. And I'll show in part 2 how Mac Miller and Elliott Smith and Frank Ocean have predictive lyrics that map onto universal symbolism and iconography that maps onto the current spirit of the age. And there's times in which some of the symbolism eerily maps onto current paradigms. So we'll take a look at Frank Ocean's album Blonde, Elliott Smith's From a Basement on a Hill, and we'll show what that has to do with the movie Good Will Hunting and John Forbes Nash Jr. and the recent fires in Boulder County and the whole pizza party stuff going on with the elites and the allegations there, whether they're true or not, whether it's a creation or an unveiling of something that's happening or something in between. The patterns map onto other manifestations of the spirit of the age, like the pandemic, which is all about the bad breath and an airborne ill spirit spreading around. And so that'll take us back to those Radiohead lyrics, and we'll look at how all of these things are positioned and juxtaposed next to each other in this kind of web of connections. And in this situation, I'd say 1 or 2 of these connections might be an interesting coincidence, but as we flesh out the web of connections, it becomes pretty clear that there's something going on. And an atheist would probably use the Jungian paradigms to explain these seemingly predictive and precognitive patterns and symbols embedded in human creative output. I'm a Gnostic Christian, and I take that kind of perspective, so I can articulate this in secular, psychoanalytic, and even atheist paradigms, but I believe it's something spiritual, and it has to do with the illusory nature of reality and the human being's spiritual faculty to tap into God's book, or the collective memory, or the Akashic records, as they've been referred to. So I'm certainly willing to admit that other religions and spiritual traditions other than the one I practiced have also tapped into these truths and represented them in their own language and their own ideas. And it's still happening today. So an artist in a band like Radiohead, or Frank Ocean, Elliott Smith, Mac Miller, or filmmakers in Hollywood, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, and whoever else wrote Good Will Hunting. I think it was William Goldman that worked on that and did some ghostwriting. Anyway, whoever worked on that stuff could be tapping into this spiritual pool of truth, and the creative act is a truth-bearing faculty, whether we realize it or not. And elite people who are up to no good and doing some deceptive stuff also have to get creative in their deceptions, and when they're putting together intuitively a crafted illusion or deception, they also will tap into these patterns, although they tend to invert them So it does take an amount of decoding in order to understand what's going on. And that would allow me to take a look at the Coen brothers' film No Country for Old Men, based on Cormac McCarthy, a novelist who often reads like Shakespeare mixed with biblical poetry. And I can find patterns in there that might, on the surface level, look pretty negative and scary and even evil. But then when we do the inversion, we're working with the same exact patterns and symbols inverted, and they tell a different story that's not so scary and not all doom and gloom. So that's where I'll be going in part 2. We're going to tie this web of connections together, and there's going to be some optimism and some good news in there about the changing spirit of the age. So join me in part 2. And that'll be loading shortly. I'm almost done with that video as well. So that's coming soon. Thanks for coming out. Good night. God bless. And I wouldn't be able to do this if it wasn't for my patrons, my Patreon supporters, my patrons over at patreon.com/Bickford. So hit me up there if you want to keep this party going. Thanks for coming out.
Jack, don't you think we'd be better off in some other part of the room away from all this flying glass?
No, we're okay here.
Mandrake, you realize that in addition to fluoridating water, where there are studies underway to fluoridate salt, flour, fruit juices, soup, sugar, milk, ice cream, Mandrake, children's ice cream. Good. You know when fluoridation first began?
No, I don't, Jack.
1946. 1946, Mandrake. How does that coincide with your post-war commie conspiracy? It's incredibly obvious, isn't it? A foreign substance is introduced into our precious bodily fluids without the knowledge of the individual, certainly without any choice. That's the way your hardcore commie works.